Doncs comencem. Ens han donat ja força arguments per arromangar-nos i començar a treballar, i això és el que farem de la mà d'una conferència que jo encara no l'he sentit com ningú, però que és molt, molt prometedora. Em limitaré a presentar el David Calnitsky, explicar-vos per què vam pensar que seria interessant que vingués a obrir el nostre simposi, el 22è simposi, i emmarcar alguns dels debats que sempre ens han interessat. Aquests dies hem descobert que tenim una persona comuna que hem valorat molt, ell l'ha conegut molt més perquè va ser el seu director de tesi, que és el sociòleg nord-americà Eric Olin Wright, que va morir fa pocs anys, que feia una distinció molt interessant entre les justificacions estàtiques, ara se'n parlava d'això, i les justificacions dinàmiques de la renda bàsica. Les justificacions estàtiques són les que tenen a veure amb el recompte de gent que sortiria, quantitativament, que sortiria de la pobresa o de l'exclusió social si tingués l'existència material garantida. Grans notícies. Però ell deia, hi ha una cosa que és encara més no, però també és molt important i que és el que fa que tants i tantes ens hi dediquem tantíssim a la renda bàsica, que són les justificacions dinàmiques, són els tipus de vides que podríem posar en circulació molt més lliures, més autònomes, aquestes vides, en cas de tenir una renda bàsica. Per tant, d'entrada, sembla que bones notícies per les tradicions emancipatòries, en sentit ampli, o si voleu dir-ho així, per les esquerres, en sentit ampli i ben divers. Però les esquerres, al mateix temps, en sentit ampli i divers, també han plantejat dubtes respecte a la renda bàsica, i no són tonteries, no són absurditats. Per exemple, a vegades s'ha dit que la renda bàsica pot tenir efectes individualitzadors, perquè, clar, com que és una cosa individual, doncs la gent es posa a negociar de forma individualitzada. En aquest punt, per exemple, el David Calnitsky ens diu sí, però plantegem-nos també fins a quin punt podria ser un camí, precisament, perquè ens garanteix l'existència, per institucionalitzar la solidaritat en clau emancipadora. Per exemple, i aquí tenim uns companys i companyes bascos que això ho han vist i ho han treballat des de fa 30 anys. Per exemple, els sindicats podrien arribar a ser més atractius perquè podrien oferir més si hi hagués una renda bàsica? Sí o no? Són preguntes que s'han de deixar a l'aire. Una altra reserva de les esquerres, però no seria millor el control col·lectiu dels mitjans de producció que una renda bàsica? Molts creiem, i crec que segurament en David també, que la renda bàsica pot ser un mitjà més que permeti aquest control col·lectiu, entès també en sentit ampli, dels mitjans de producció. El propi David s'ha preguntat si la renda bàsica, i avui en parlarà una miqueta, pot afavorir la desmercantilització de la força de treball, l'abandonament de tasques obertament desagradables. Però no obstant això, la pregunta aquesta de no hi ha alternatives millors des de les esquerres ressona i ressona, i nosaltres no hem convertit la renda bàsica en un fetitx que hem de reverenciar. Doncs bé, el David Calnitsky ens semblava una persona sumament interessant per obrir aquest simposi perquè ha donat resposta o ha intentat donar resposta o almenys ha entrat a debatre amb els crítics intel·ligents de les esquerres i ho ha fet amb plantejaments, a més, i amb horitzons polítics que ens poden ressonar molt a la gent de la xarxa renda bàsica, de la red renda bàsica, amb aquesta idea que es pot pensar la renda bàsica en clau emancipadora i es pot situar com un dels eixos, tan central com vulguem, però un dels eixos d'una economia política popular, que és el terme que s'utilitzava a l'ala esquerra de la Revolució Francesa, però pel segle XXI. Per exemple, es pregunta en David Calnitsky, per què podem dir que la renda bàsica podria ser una reforma no reformista? Això ell ho ha escrit. Una reforma que potser ens situï a les fronteres del capitalisme o que contradigui les dinàmiques desposseïdores més centrals i fonamentals del capitalisme. Per exemple, es pregunta, i estic acabant ja, en quins sentits ens otorga la renda bàsica, i tornem a l'Eric Olin Wright, ens otorga el poder social, un terme que utilitza molt l'Eric Olin Wright, el poder social que necessitem per eixamplar la nostra autonomia, que se suposa que és un dels objectius centrals de la proposta de la renda bàsica, i que també és un dels objectius centrals de les tradicions emancipatòries contemporànies. I també es pregunta el David Calnitsky, i en quins sentits o sota quines circumstàncies pot tot aquest potencial emancipatori de la renda bàsica veure's afeblit? Perquè sabem que la renda bàsica no és una panacea de validesa universal i unívoca. Per tot això, ens va semblar superinteressant, supernecessari, convidar en David Calnitsky a obrir el 22è Simposi de la Xarxa Renda Bàsica, el de Lleida, i sobretot en un moment en què el debat social de la renda bàsica bull a Catalunya, arran del pla pilot, parlarà de plans pilot. El David Calnitsky és també un gran expert en plans pilot canadencs, però no només canadencs, y no només a Catalunya. La proposta de la renda bàsica bull, hierve en el conjunto del Reino de España i a moltes altres contrades. Em limito ara a resumir-vos un llarguíssim currículum que podríem reproduir, però que no cal reproduir, però perquè situeu una miqueta més enllà dels continguts, els llocs on treballa, els temes que toca. En David Calnitsky és professor del Departament de Sociologia a la Western University del Canadà. Això està a Ontario, al costat de Toronto. Els seus interessos de recerca inclouen la teoria sociològica, la política social i la pobresa, i el seu treball empíric ha examinat l'impacte de la renda bàsica en quantitat d'aspectes, des dels salaris, la nostra relació amb el treball en sentit ampli, l'estigma social o els processos d'estigmatització social que potser ens podríem estalviar, dinàmiques de gènere, etc. I ara, més recentment, ha estat fent recerca també sobre estat del benestar, sobre acció col·lectiva i sobre canvi social. Està treballant en 2 llibres a qual més interessante. El primer d'ells examina com el canvi social ocorre i fracassa. És un llibre que té crec que ho puc anunciar perquè el títol no és un gran spoiler, perquè és el títol d'un article previ que ja he escrit, que és el The Public Policy Road to Socialism, el camí a través de la política pública cap al socialisme, que d'alguna manera és una broma amb del títol d'aquell vell article de Van Parijs i Van der Veen, el camí capitalista al comunisme. El camí a través de la política social al socialisme. Això per una banda, i per altra banda està fent un llibre amb el Michael McCarthy, on analitza i reconstrueix la teoria social precisament de l'Eric Olin Wright, que sembla que aquesta introducció sigui un homenatge cap a l'Eric Olin Wright, cosa que es mereix perfectament. Ens feia molta il·lusió tenir-lo aquí i aquí el tenim. So, David, the floor is yours. We really want to listen to you. It's your turn.
Does it change? Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. It's really exciting to share my work today, and thanks in particular to Brew, to David, and to the organizers, Mariona. I think this event is fantastic, and really it's an honor to be able to share my ideas with you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I also apologize because I'm going to lose my voice. I am sadly sick a little bit. Okay, I'm going to, however, get right to it. So I'm going to talk about the basic income debate, and I'm going to go over my findings from a basic income experiment, which I've done research on. In particular, I'm going to talk about a 3-year guaranteed annual income experiment that took place in the 1970s in Manitoba, which was called Mincome. And I'd like to start with my own normative perspective on basic income as an emancipatory project. And then I'm going to present some research, and I'm going to focus in particular on some empirical work on the impact of basic income on wages, on employer-employee relations, and on the labor market more broadly. And then I'm going to look a little bit more closely I'm going to give my perspective on two recent papers. This is sort of the contribution to a discussion about the debate about basic income on the left. First, I'm going to briefly give my perspective on a paper that was published by Birnbaum and de Wispelaar. And then finally, I'm going to give my perspective on a recent paper by a basic income critic, Alex Gurevich. I'm going to give some of my replies to him, which I am in the process of writing up as a paper with Mike Howard, who some people might know. Okay. So I have two sort of high-level, zoomed-out overviews of the basic income debate published in the journal Catalyst. The first is a sort of overview of the debate on the left, and the second is another rejoinder to a paper written by Alex Gurevich and a co-author, Lucas Stanchek. And one thing that I say at the outset in both of the papers is I give my kind of core normative motivation for being interested in basic income in the first place, right? So my interest in basic income is connected to the greater social and economic bargaining power it affords to poor and working people in labor markets, but also domestically, right? So I'm referring often to women in bad marriages or marriages of economic dependence and so on. In terms of social policies in general, I like to distinguish between, on the one hand, policies that benefit people, and on the other, ones that empower or strengthen people, right? So we can distinguish, in other words, between, on the one hand, ameliorative reforms, and on the other, emancipatory reforms. So traditional welfare policies, as practiced, these are, I would say, ameliorative, right? They provide benefits, and I support them, but they do not really, as programs, expand people's power. So in my view, basic income and similar kinds of policies, the guaranteed annual income, I think it's significant because it provides exit options. Now, there are some objections to this view, which I'll mention later, but I do think that Widerquist and others are right to say that it gives people the power to say no, right? So from a broadly socialist perspective, which is where I'm coming from, these points, I think, can be described in terms of a critique of capitalism. So I think one of the foundational critiques of capitalist labor markets is that they are superficially free, but substantively unfree, right? So non-owners of the means of production, workers, can choose between capitalists, but ultimately are forced to choose one, right? Marx calls this sarcastically a double freedom, right? Our freedom to be exploited by the employer, by any employer of our choosing, is coupled with the freedom to remain hungry should we choose none, right? So for people who object to the de facto compulsory nature of the capitalist labor market, for people, in other words, who are committed to the idea of expanding the realm of human freedom, basic income, I think, is appealing, right? It's appealing because it ensures that people have not only the abstract liberal right to freedom, but also the material resources to make that freedom a lived reality, right? Or if you talk about freedom as a continuous rather than as a dichotomous or binary variable, something that I'll mention again at the end of the talk, well, it improves, I would say, people's freedom, right? Freedom is I think, a continuous variable. It's a scale, it's a spectrum, and basic income can make people not just choosy, but choosier. And I think that's true even at lower levels. It has this property. In the language, in the economist's language, it can raise the reservation wage, it can make you less likely to accept undesirable situations. Okay, so again, I'm talking about expanding freedom in the sense of the power to say no. The power to say no refers to the power to say no to a bad employer, to unpleasant work, or to patriarchal domination in the home. In providing alternatives, you are impacting underlying power relations, right? You're changing the background conditions in which negotiation takes place, both at work and at home. Right? To kind of add emphasis, basic income provides exit options from some of the key sites of domination in people's lives. So what are two of the most important sites of domination in many people's lives? Well, it's the workplace and the family. This talk is going to focus on work, but I have written about both, and from my perspective, basic income is appealing because it promises to weaken relations of domination in both of these arenas of life. Okay. However, in truth, it really is not, in my view, clear or entirely obvious what the actual direct and indirect ramifications of an implemented basic income might be. There has been a lot of academic debate and much more popular discussion around basic income, yet despite the enthusiasm, I still think that we have to admit that we do have a limited understanding of these policies. Just think about how much debate, for example, there is about the minimum wage. This is a policy that actually has been implemented in the world, and there's still a huge amount of debate about its alleged effects one way or the other. If you don't agree about the minimum wage debate, take any other already implemented policy, and you'll see there still is a big debate typically about the actual empirical effects. So I just think that we shouldn't be overconfident about likely impacts. Most of the discussion about basic income is speculative, and the empirical work typically comes out of randomized control trials, which I do think are useful. I think they're great, but they also have some important flaws. In particular, with respect to questions where social interaction is relevant, which would be the world, a lot of the world, right? Social interaction tends to be relevant, and typically randomized controlled trials in those circumstances just can't ask questions about the reality of social life. Nonetheless, I do think that empirical work is, and some of these experiments are immensely valuable, because the best way to try to figure out what might happen when you change key aspects of a system that's as complex as the work-income relationship is to actually observe it, right? So I am going to present some of that evidence, and then, as I said, I'm going to return at the end to some of these normative questions. Okay. So the evidence that I'm going to present is from the Mincome experiment, and I'm going to try to build a case for basic income's normative desirability. First, some background. So, a few details on Mincome. It was funded by the Canadian and Manitoba governments. Everyone in a small town of around 10,000 people called Dauphin had the option to access about 20,000, or probably I would say it's about $24,000 in contemporary American dollar terms for about 3 years. Everyone was mailed one of these. There's also a separate randomized control trial portion of the experiment that takes place in Winnipeg and also elsewhere in Manitoba. In the Dauphin case, everyone in the town could join. In the Winnipeg setup, they use these sort of randomized and dispersed individual treatments and control subjects, right? So the big question is, what happens when you eliminate poverty, right, as the sort of ever-present background condition of daily life? What happens when you weaken people's dependence on the labor market for survival? Okay, so I'm going to tell a little bit of Mincome's history, then provide some evidence on work. Do people actually work less? Typically this is the first issue that comes up whenever basic income is discussed. After all, if you dramatically weaken economic activity, that could undermine the tax base for basic income itself. So in my data, yeah, they do. They do work somewhat less. And I use qualitative and quantitative evidence to try to get at some of the reasoning behind those drops in waged work. For example, care work and education are often cited in the qualitative evidence. And then I'm going to look at the labor market from the employer's perspective. So how does reducing people's market dependence impact business? Does it impact the wages that get offered? Okay. A final sort of crucial issue to state up front, there were a bunch of other experiments at the time in the US. They were all randomized control trials which examined isolated individual treatment and control subjects, scattered across various towns and cities, and many of the recent experiments are set up in this way too. As I said, Mincome has this RCT element in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, but the Dauphin portion is unusual in that it takes place within the setting of a community where everyone can join. In the new Catalonia experiment, my understanding is that the plan is to have 2 sites that are universal, somewhat similar to the Dauphin plan. And I could be wrong, but I don't think we have other cases where rich countries have tested the guaranteed income or a basic income at the level of an entire town. And I think that's important in my research because it means you can start to observe, you can start to ask questions about macro effects and about social interaction effects that are just completely ignored, that are assumed out of existence when you have a small group of subjects that get the basic income in a sea of non-participants. Okay. So very briefly, a potted history of Mincome. In the late 1960s, Canadian poverty activists and academics and policymakers are impacted by a number of frightening reports about the extent of poverty in Canada. At the same time, there's growing awareness about the American experiments and the broader discussion about the guaranteed income with Nixon's family assistance plan, which nearly passes in Congress. Okay, so the newly elected NDP government, that is Canada's kind of social democratic party in the province of Manitoba. They proposed this experiment with the idea that it just would become a nationwide program. The premier at the time, Ed Schreier, he says he thinks the guaranteed income is necessary and inevitable, right? He says that the government of Manitoba is explicitly dedicated to try to create greater equality in the conditions of life of ordinary citizens in the province, right? He was a genuine, I think, social democrat. And he framed the guaranteed income in the context of poverty, but also in the context of inequality, right? He says in the same press release that he thinks that the pay gap between a captain of industry and rank-and-file workers should be no more than 2.5 to 1, right? He says that's a realistic goal to strive for. It's also, I think, worth mentioning that Schreier has worried about some of the questions that I'm asking and some of the questions that have plagued the debate on the left. He says, in a sense, is there a danger that we will be subsidizing local merchants? Would employers hold back on wage increases, which otherwise might have been granted, right? Which in effect would be supplemented. Such a result, he says, would defeat the ends that we're trying to achieve, right? This is a big worry on the left. Is there a world where wages actually go down as a result of the basic income? But really his focus was on linking the guaranteed income, basic income, to this old problem of dividing up the poor into separate social categories. He says that if we can get around the legal barriers, which so rigidly separate those who are employed from those on welfare, then surely we'll have made a solid step forward. Okay, so all of this is to say that this moment signals a kind of high watermark in Canadian social policy. At least the abolition of poverty, the complete overhaul of social policy really is on the historical agenda. So the project itself lasts 3 years. It's underfunded. Payments to families do not get cut, but basically the whole research wing does get cut. Mincome comes to an ignominious, sad end. Most of the survey data that is painstakingly collected just gets warehoused. Some parts do get digitized, but for the most part, they do not. The Dauphin part just sits. No final report is ever written. Eventually, about 1,800 boxes of raw data land in Winnipeg. Only by 2009 do they make a finding guide to make sense of it. Okay, so I digitized some of these surveys, and a few surveys were already digitized. I digitized a number of the surveys. I'm going to present some of this evidence. For the sake of time, I'm maybe not going to give all of the details. If you're curious, you can ask afterwards. But essentially, a guaranteed income is a little bit different from a basic income. The guaranteed income essentially gives you a grant of a certain amount, $19,500 in 2014 dollars, and essentially it phases out as your income rises, as your labor market income rises. If you don't work at all, for whatever reason, your guarantee is that $19,000. That's the floor. And that's about 50% of the median wage at the time. So, and these are the different groups that I'm comparing. In the Dauphin group, people receive Mincome amidst other potential recipients. So that means you're capturing individual effects and indirect effects, social effects as well, right? You're capturing what I would say are the sort of real world social interactions that might matter. In the dispersed treatment in other Manitoba towns, here people receive Mincome, but again are living in the context of just ordinary capitalist labor markets. And then finally, there's a non-recipient control group, also in ordinary labor markets. This is just a geographic situation. So I want to start with work. This is administrative data from the experiment. There are different ways, I think, to think about this question of work, about labor market participation. People might reduce work, but in the real world, there might be a kind of back and forth with firms that wouldn't happen in an RCT, right? Firms might pull wages up, which could bring people back in to the labor market, right? Or it could also be the case that people might decide to work less at those higher wages, right? Well, that's sometimes called the income effect and the substitution effect in economics. You are, in the Dauphin case, you're incorporating this these kinds of dynamics that are just not there in any of the randomized control trials, right? Which are just sort of individual drops in a bucket of a large labor market that employers are not going to notice, right? And in the Dauphin community experiment, where people see others adjusting to the program, you might adjust too, right? I think this effect is probably more important, right? You could call it a copycat effect, right? And you can incorporate this kind of a feedback in a social, in a broader social community experiment, right? Social norms might also start to shift around when a community suddenly faces a radically different social assistance regime, right? Joining might come to take on less social stigma. Still, I think in both kinds of experiments, the simple individual level mechanism, your ability to pick up and exit the labor force, still is crucial, and we do see it. So here I'm comparing Dauphin Mincomers before and then during the experiment to Manitoba controls before and then during. And you can calculate the total effect by looking at the difference internal to the control group and then comparing that to the changes or the difference internal to the Dauphin group. And the total labor market effect I calculate as about 11 percentage points. You can then add in this Manitoba RCT group, this treatment, people who received this treatment but were dispersed across these Manitoba towns. And essentially you're able to compare with the community context, right? And in the community context, when people get it amidst other people, you see greater declines, right? Perhaps there are social interactions, perhaps there's some level of copycatting that explains the greater declines in labor force participation in Dauphin. Okay, so what were people up to if they dropped out of the labor market? There's been very little work, I think, on this question of people's non-employment activities under a basic income. There has been a ton of speculation. One theory of basic income says that, posits that our deepest desire in life is to relax at home, right? An alternative hypothesis predicts that a host of socially valuable activities get activated, right? Care work, education, artistic endeavors, activism, and so on. These are unleashed when people's basic needs are secured outside of the labor market. So some of these questions are just not askable, given my data, but I think it's worth considering the possibilities nonetheless. So in the qualitative data that I have, in the sort of Mincome commentary, there are hints about what people were up to when they, and why they participated or why they withdrew from the labor market. About 11% unprompted say that they withdrew from the labor market, and they emphasize a few different things. They emphasize using Mincome to, as a help to go to school. We had the chance to improve our educational level in order to improve our income, or to help care for family. I wanted to spend a year at home with my children, or just not finding work, or not being able to work, right? And then that's the sort of qualitative. There's also some quantitative data asking what non-employed people were up to when they weren't working. This is from a separate paper. There were only so many options in this survey, but the biggest reason explaining why people were not working, again, comparing changes internal to the treatment and changes internal to the control, the biggest reason is, quote, job/work conditions, right? Which means people were more likely to not be working because of a labor dispute, right? This is about job/work conditions is almost 6 percentage points. right? They said that either they weren't working because of some kind of labor dispute or because the available wages were too low, right? Perhaps this is an exit strategy, and so on. And the negative number here, 3.8, under the category ill or disabled, for example, that means on this graph that the intervention led to a decline in health-related non-employment, right? Health-related non-employment reasons. So fewer people were out of the labor market because of illness and disability. There are other positive effects, reasons why people were not working. Family moves by 4 percentage points. Also, one category called did not want to work, right? Is about 4 percentage points. That's open to interpretation. Given the other categories that are available, you could interpret that as closer to leisure. You also have self-employment. It's about 2.7%, and education is about the same. So the data doesn't let us ask about all kinds of questions that might be interesting here, but some positive effects in not working for family or leisure or job/work conditions or education, I think are pretty interesting. Okay, so now some of these questions naturally lead to further questions. The not working due to job/work conditions, it doesn't exactly get at what people do with their time, but it does get at dynamics between employers and employees, which we might want to know about. So what happens there? Oops. Okay. So I want to move to the reaction from business. This paper is published at Socioeconomic Review, and we're talking again about reducing workers' market dependence, but now I want to look at the perspective from employers. So here we want to know, how did employers respond to a scenario where the whole labor force has access to a basic income? So one of the surveys that are conducted here, which I digitized, is a kind of census of all of the businesses in Dauphin, and then some control towns. They're sent out at a baseline and then during the study. Again, this is the kind of question, I think, that's only askable in a community or broader social experiment, rather than a randomized control trial, when you give just sort of a scattered handful of people the guaranteed income. Here, employers are going to notice, right? In a community context, employers are going to notice when all workers can potentially avoid work. Okay, so the main question is, did worker exit power force wages up? Did labor markets tighten? Or, as some people argue, did the government supplement allow firms to lower wages? Was it really just an employer subsidy? Perhaps like the earned income tax credit is in the United States, or at least as some argue the earned income tax credit is, which is a policy that's conditional on work. It's a cash transfer that's conditional on work in the US. So just to kind of explain some of the arguments here, the first argument, the first view, says that labor markets might tighten either because workers exit perhaps as an explicit bargaining strategy, or just to do something else, school, take care of family, etc., on the one hand, or it's an unintended effect because fewer workers apply or fewer workers accept jobs with bad terms, right? All of this happens because of the background conditions for workers are more favorable. That's the first argument. The second argument says that income maintenance policies are employer subsidies, right? So I want to just spend a second trying to elaborate what this view actually is. I think there are three views here. One that I'm calling the functionalist view, one I'm calling the unintended consequence view, and one is the strategic view. I just want to elaborate what the actual argument is because they're often mentioned. So the first kind of version of this argument, what I'm calling the functionalist view, my interpretation is that it says that there is a subsistence wage out there in the world, and any government, right, there's a level that workers have to get in terms of wages, and any supplement that makes workers better able to survive allows employers then to reduce their contribution to that subsistence level, right? Only the subsistence wage has the effect of producing, a capitalist equilibrium. This is why I'm calling it functionalist, right? The subsistence wage can be explained by its effects in stabilizing capitalism. If wages get too high, then on this view, population is going to grow and more competition is going to kick in to bring wages back in line, right? And the opposite is true if wages get too low. This is an old political economy perspective. And I think that the idea of subsistence, a subsistence wage, turns out to be pretty thorny. This view, I think, just has a hard time trying to come to terms with just changing wages over time. But also, if it is true, I think that this particular perspective should apply to literally any welfare state policy. As an aside, I think there's a rule of thumb in basic income debates, in basic income criticism, which is essentially this: whenever someone raises some criticism of basic income, you should ask yourself, does this criticism also apply to any expansion of the welfare state, right? Or is it specific to basic income, right? So often, the criticisms could also be true of expanding public health care or any piece of the welfare state. I would say this tends to be true for something like on the order of 80% of the arguments, right? Why doesn't public health care also lower the subsistence wage, et cetera, et cetera? Okay. The second unintended consequences view, the second view says that income subsidies might increase the labor supply and competition would be a sort of byproduct. As a byproduct, competition would lower wages. I think this could be true if the policy was conditional on work in the way the American Earned Income Tax Credit is, but an income subsidy that's not conditional on work would not grow the labor supply, in my view. So in this second view, the second view requires that basic income somehow increases the labor supply, makes it so that more people are working. I think there's evidence, my own evidence suggests that basic income doesn't do this. Okay, and then the last view, the last version of this argument says that firms are aware of social policies and they specifically plan to lower wages that they know that workers would accept. So I think this could be true in some circumstances, but in a even semi-competitive context, it would also allow firms that could afford ordinary wages to poach workers. And also, if that is not happening, then it really does require collusion across all firms in the labor market, which might not be sustainable. But again, I think this could be true for any policy. Okay, all right. Okay, so those are the views. Those are the different views. What happens? I'm first going to start with A couple employer comments. There's a qualitative survey. Just a couple data points here. In the survey, there's a little bit of room for qualitative commentary by employers. One says the following: if the government wants to do something about basic annual income in Manitoba, the best thing they can do is get out of the picture and let supply and demand rule and govern what the wages and hours should be at this rate. If one wanted to eat, they'd have to work. The program is just spoiling people rotten and upsetting the workforce, something unreal. The hours people have to work and the wages they get and the output that they give, which isn't much, just makes it impossible for the average employer to even stand a chance at hiring help, right? This guy doesn't like it. And another employer, there's other employers that have similar kinds of comments. Job applicants were unacceptable because they were not willing to train at a reduced salary. But in the main, the survey collects quantitative data and it asks about the wages firms offer before and during, and in control towns before and during. So I'm just going to present that evidence. Okay, these are just descriptive statistics. And what I find is a big increase in the median wages that are offered on job vacancies on the part of Dauphin firms, and no change in the control towns. Okay? Similarly, again, wages on new hires, wages for new hires, grow faster in the Dauphin case, and in the control, they just sort of keep up with inflation. And one part of the explanation could be a tightening of the labor market, right? And a decline in firms receiving applications, right? So we have a decline in this yes number, right? A decline in the answer to the question, did you have any applications to your place of work? So that could be part of the explanation here. And fewer applications might have meant fewer new hires. This question asks how many new people were hired in the last 4 months. And in the Dauphin case, you have an increase in people saying no new hires. Okay, so in particular, because of the wage effects, I think it's reasonable to conclude that this exit option from the labor market improved worker power. I think that among the competing perspectives that I mentioned above, I think that the first is more likely ultimately to be true. Perhaps there's some truth to both, but at least on net, I think the first is more powerful. Okay. That's the end of the empirical stuff. Won't subject you to any more graphs or figures. I want instead to talk a little bit about what I think is a pretty interesting paper that takes a different view from my paper, from the paper that I just presented evidence from. And so this paper by Birnbaum and de Wispelaar argues that the exit strategy, which is proposed by many advocates of basic income, that is, the ability of people to, the ability of workers to leave their job, or really to threaten to leave their job by virtue of having a basic income, and which thereby improves their bargaining power in the labor market, that the argument goes, is a hollow threat, they say, right? They say that in the context of a modest basic income, and in an otherwise capitalist economy, this exit strategy, really, it's a hollow threat. Okay, and the authors argue that for basic income to work as an exit strategy, what they say is that, look, workers have to be able to credibly signal that they have an intention to leave, right? To leave their job unless conditions improve, right? They have to have a credible threat, and if employers are not persuaded that threat is realistic, well, the authors say, they won't give an inch, right? They argue that most of the important constraints that are facing workers do not really change with a basic income. And a big part of this paper is just listing how those constraints will remain in place, right? When considering this idea of an exit strategy as a tool for obtaining concessions, right? These constraints, they argue, they're just gonna remain in play even with a modest, non-trivial basic income. So they focus on this mechanism, and they think this exit strategy idea is no good, is not going to work. My view, I like the paper. I was a referee on this paper. I think it raises the level of the debate, but I do think that it's unpersuasive. If you are interested in a general view about the net impact of basic income on the labor market as a whole, on labor market bargaining, they pitch this paper as though it's about the general impact of basic income on bargaining power, right? In general, on net. But they end up saying that question, the net effect, actually that's outside the scope of their paper, because they really just want to focus on this one mechanism. So I think that, one, this is just an overly narrow focus, focusing just on this one mechanism in play in the labor market, right? Threatening, the mechanism they focus on is threatening to leave your job, not actually leaving, but threatening to leave in order to extract concessions, right? And I think there are other mechanisms that bear on bargaining power which are likely to be more important, including, a general reduction in willingness to accept or to apply to bad jobs in the first place. That can tighten the labor market. It can pull wages up. It can improve worker bargaining power. These are unintended effects, right? An unintentionally tighter labor market due to labor supply declines. It's not strategic in the same way. No one's signaling anything to a boss that they might leave if they don't behave better. This stuff is happening in the background. And it's more likely to be relevant, I think, to the overall bargaining context than these specific games of chicken that the authors are focusing on in this paper. And I think the authors probably don't disagree on this point. Also, the labor market might tighten as people exit the labor market, right? They might not be using it as a strategy at all. They're just exiting, and that affects the labor market as a whole. The objection is that this, quote, exit strategy, which involves threatening and not actually exiting, that requires having a credible threat, and they think that all these constraints will remain in place to make that threat hollow. So I just think that on balance, this is not likely to be the most important labor market mechanism to be impacted. There's a range of unintended consequences that I think are going to be a lot more important, and I think it's wrong to draw this sort of general conclusion on the basis of one mechanism. Okay, the second point is that the authors might be right that these constraints in life, these various constraints in a capitalist economy, remain in place. But the key question is, introducing a basic income, even a modest one, does that make those constraints, the overall constraints on your life, does that make them tighter or looser, right? This is not a binary. The whole paper, I think, pitches the question as if this were a binary, right? The authors give reasons why, in general, why it's hard to leave a job. Full stop, right? Not why it is harder with a basic income in place, right? They don't make that argument. And I see no good reason to think that even the narrow mechanism that they're focused on, this kind of strategic exit, would not be easier. Okay. Ultimately, I think that what we care about is the net effect of basic income on bargaining power and wages. The authors point to one mechanism and then implicitly draw this broad conclusion, rather than admitting that, perhaps the net effect, the taken together effect, might be that bargaining power and wages could grow. Okay, last, they make another point in this paper about the exit trap, which they say is also a danger in basic income. I think this is oversold. They say, quote, "The availability of a meager basic income may lead some precarious workers who strongly dislike their job to exit when it's likely to make them worse off in the medium to long run by underestimating the difficulties in securing an alternative occupation." Okay. First, I'd say that since you don't actually exit, this is an exit strategy. It's about a threat. It's not about leaving. Well, you can't fall into this exit trap if you've never left. But more importantly, the argument here in my read, the argument that they're making is basically equivalent to saying, we should not make divorce more feasible for people because, well, they might underestimate how hard it is to be single, right? How hard it is to remarry, right? Seems like, I think, in both cases, it is better to have the option rather than to not have that option, right? Having more options, yes, having a lot of options on a dating market might lead you to pass over a decent catch, but I think that doesn't sound like a good argument against options in general. Ooh, okay. Okay, so I'm ultimately not persuaded by their approach to basic income in the labor market. I want to say something about this other very recent paper about basic income. I'm working on a reply to this piece with Mike Howard. It's this broad and sweeping critique of basic income and of the post-work left. Some parts I agree with, but I'm going to sort of focus especially on his perspective on basic income. What Gurvich argues, his argument is that there is an economic deception at the core of basic income. He says that the claim that UBI frees people from needing work, it's deceptive, right? It presents an image of society in which work is purely optional. Yet, he argues, work is only optional if some are doing the necessary labor to produce the goods that people buy. Right? Put another way, unconditional basic income can be extended to each individual conditional on some working, right? He says an unconditional basic income might be individually unconditional, but it is collectively conditional, right? And because it is collectively conditional, the claims that basic income expand people's freedom, is deceptive, right? The claims that basic income is emancipatory is in fact deceptive because it is collectively conditional. That's the argument. My view is, I think this paper works in part as a critique of some of this literature on, quote, post-work, but it's really not a good criticism of basic income per se, and he conflates the two throughout the paper. Perhaps post-work thinking envisions a world where everyone gets basic income and then nobody at all works. But that's obviously not the only way one has to think about basic income. It's not my perspective, nor is it Van Parijs's or Eric Wright's perspective. I would say if you think about basic income more realistically, I don't see any economic deception to expose. The question of whether or not people work and to what degree is just a precondition for the system working. And so it's a standard part of what you test in experimental settings, rather than a deception, as the paper describes, it's a hypothesis, right? It's the core hypothesis of basic income. Can we have a world where you have a basic income and most people still work, but some don't anymore, and some don't as much, right? Can that form a stable equilibrium? Well, if it can, then people who don't work anymore are, I would say, less coerced, and the remainder are working, but under conditions that are far more voluntary. If that equilibrium exists, which I think it can, and that's what my evidence suggests, then I think we should say we're living in a freer world. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I just want to make a couple points on this paper. So Gurvich wants to argue that basic income says that Gourevitch wants to argue that basic income does not lead to this expansion of freedom. And the key reason is he wants to say that if everyone is not able to exit the labor market at once, then you don't have freedom. It is collectively conditional. On this point, I would say, in general, I don't think we have to pitch freedom as a binary. I see it as a continuous variable. The question is, does basic income make people more free? Even though everyone cannot exit work at once, are we not more free given that some of us at different times can and do exit work? I would say yes. I just wanted to I have a couple sort of comparisons that I want to stress. So here's an example. I have just a couple thought experiments to think about his argument. Imagine all of us. Imagine a bunch of kids on an adventure in the woods, and we rotate keeping watch at night so that others can sleep. It is true that we cannot all sleep at once, right? But isn't everyone in this scenario better able to sleep? I would say yes. Okay, here's another thought experiment, another example. Does fractional reserve commercial banking work even though it's true that not everyone can freely withdraw their funds at once, right? Is it possible for everyone to withdraw all of their savings from a bank at the same time? No, it's not. Right? Do we see this system as one where we are free to withdraw our savings when we want? Yes, we do, right? Okay, so the implicit reply that Gourevitch has in the paper is an argument from G.A. Cohen, which I reference over here, which is from a paper called The Structure of Proletariat Unfreedom. The argument here is that the proletariat is not free just because some people can become capitalists, right? The point is the whole proletariat cannot at once escape their status, right? And so they are not free, the proletariat, right? Or what I would say is an even clearer example here, prisons are clearly not free by virtue of the fact that some prisoners do manage to escape prison, right? The empirical fact of prison escapees does not reveal the true freedom of all prisoners, right? Okay, so the question is, I think, with respect to this paper, is basic income more like the prison example, or is basic income more like the banking example? So the question for me is, what do you want in each scenario? In the prison example, what you want, what everyone wants at all times, is to freely exit, right? Everyone wants to exit prison at the same time. In the banking example, what you want mostly is to have your money in the bank, but sometimes you want to freely withdraw it, right? So I think that basic income is closer to the latter, right? Most people, most of the time, are going to want to work for various reasons. But some people, some of the time, for various reasons at different points in their life, will want to exit work. And as long as the desires of most people are to work in some capacity, most of the time, then people should be understood as freely able to exit. It is a system that is, I would say, compatible with what people are freely choosing. So I don't think you really need to have a system where everyone can simultaneously exit the labor market for basic income to count as providing freedom. There's other parts of this paper that I disagree with. He has a kind of Arbeit macht frei kind of worldview, but I'm not going to elaborate. I'm just going to wrap up because I'm running out of time. So just a couple remarks to sum up. To conclude some of the points from the business response paper, I think it's possible to imagine an income maintenance system that does benefit or serve business. Specifically, though, it would have to be one, in my view, where policies are conditional on work, income transfer programs that are conditional on work, like the American Earned Income tax credit that increases the labor supply. But a comprehensive basic income policy, or one like Mincome, I think, ones that improve worker power and wages, are just unlikely to garner business support, are unlikely to garner support from employers. The hope is that if a policy were instituted, even in a partial way, its popularity would then swamp any business opposition. Okay, a couple very brief final points on work and labor markets. I think that a basic income that genuinely makes work optional might mean that some people would work less in formal labor markets. I think that work reduction is this point that basic income advocates really equivocate on. On the one hand, we often favor liberation from the employment relation, right? Freedom from waged work is sometimes regarded as this, great unrealized historic opportunity, always just on the horizon. It's often argued that basic income is desirable because it provides people with the freedom to do what they want with their time, the freedom to spend their days as they choose, right? And that includes leisure. And that might not be that politically vendible. But then, on the other hand, basic income advocates often prefer to find results from experiments that seem to show little or no work reduction. I think my findings are roughly what you want. No work reduction would mean no expansion of freedom, no lessening of toil, but extreme work reduction could unravel the program, right? Moreover, work reduction can mean increases in other socially valuable activities. But it can also have an impact on bargaining between employers and employees. And here again, I think there is some equivocation from basic income advocates. You see some people who want to say that it might improve worker bargaining power, but then others want to say, no, employers would be fine with it, right? They're not going to present a barrier at all. Business is going to be completely on board with a basic income that is actually desirable. Well, I think you probably can't have it both ways, and I think it's reasonable to expect some employer opposition to a desirable basic income. That doesn't mean it's unattainable. I just think it's not necessarily going to be easy. So, some conclusions about basic income in the labor market from my own normative perspective. I think that so long as one, the growth in persons doing no socially valuable labor is not explosive, so as to undermine the program's viability, and so long as the growth in wages and worker power is not so explosive as to spark a kind of mass employer exit from the economy, then I think the underlying moral arguments, i.e. that workers ought not be forced into the labor market on pain of starvation, that leisure ought not only be the sole province of the rich, as long as those kind of fatal outcomes do not come to pass, then I think the moral arguments can stand on their own. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. I think we all envy you because of the fact that you had data. Because here in our country, apparently politicians have decided that we can frozen the budget of a massively interesting pilot. So for the moment, we won't have this kind of empirical data, which I think you analyzed in a very interesting way. And this is where our hope, combining it with all this more theoretical or political approach. So thank you very much for your presentation. Estem fora de temps, però m'escriu la Mariona que no ens posem nerviosos ni nervioses. A 1:15 hauríem de començar la següent sessió, però bueno, podem començar a 20. Això vol dir que hem de fer un break, una pausa. Per tant, d'aquí uns 20 minuts, 20 i pocs, hauríem de començar ja. Però, per tant, això també vol dir que tenim uns 10 minutets per si algú vol fer alguna pregunta, que espero que sí, alguna pregunta, algun comentari, allà dalt n'hi ha un, te'l pujo. N'hi ha un altre. Penseu que tenim uns 10 minutets, autogestionem-nos de manera raonable.
Bé, doncs, primer de tot dir que realment interessantíssima la teva conferència, David, però de les moltes preguntes que et voldria fer, només te'n faig dos, intentaré ser el més sintètic possible, precisament el més sintètic possible precisament pel poc temps que tenim. La primera és, no creus que part, o almenys els que fan aquestes crítiques, com el mateix Gurevich i altres, que òbviament no has pogut citar, aquestes crítiques de que la renda bàsica podria afectar el mercat laboral de la manera que ells ho diuen, no creus que en realitat també amaga o hi ha en el fons un gran envelliment del mercat laboral per part d'aquests autors? El mercat laboral en les condicions actuals. Aquesta seria la primera pregunta. I la segona és, com segur que saps, una de les... Envelliment vol dir envelliment de bellesa, de bellesa. Bueno, de bellesa amb B alta, vull dir. Exacte. Sí, és que això d'envelliment, a més, en català és o amb B alta o amb B baixa, perquè si no... Sí, una putada, sí. I l'altra pregunta és, en els debats que hem tingut alguna vegada amb alguns sindicats, es repeteix un argument, i és, d'acord, la renda bàsica augmentaria el poder individual dels treballadors, però en canvi debilitaria el poder col·lectiu dels treballadors. M'agradaria saber la teva opinió sobre aquestes dues coses.
Com que anem just de temps, recollim les 2, 3, 4, 5 intervencions que hi hagi i després li deixem al David que tanqui.
Jo vaig molt ràpid també i em va bé que hagi fet el Dani perquè va en el mateix sentit. Com que has parlat molt dels resultats en el mercat laboral, en el mercat de treball de l'experiment de Manitoba, et volia preguntar, més enllà de l'experiment de Manitoba, fins a quin punt els experiments de renda bàsica es poden valorar com exitosos o com un fracàs, prioritzant o subratllant bàsicament els seus resultats en el mercat laboral, en el mercat de treball. Fins a quin punt aquesta és una variable o és un resultat tan important a tenir en compte a l'hora d'avaluar l'èxit o el fracàs de qualsevol projecte pilot.
Jo reprenc una mica el tema dels plans pilot, sobretot incidint amb aquest aspecte que tu ja has esmentat i que ahir, a la reunió que vam tenir a l'oficina del Pla Pilot, també vas insistir de valorar els plans pilot que s'han fet de saturació en una comunitat respecte als plans pilots de selecció aleatòria individual, que també se n'han fet molts. I en aquest sentit, els potencials que té fer-ho amb una comunitat sencera. En aquest sentit, com el que es va fer a Manitoba i que, en principi, tenim també projectat a Catalunya. Bé, no, em referia a això, a la importància o com tu destaques el fet que és superior a nivell informatiu per obtenir dades a nivell de comunitat que es faci un experiment, un pla pilot en una comunitat sencera i no de forma aleatòria individual.
Es súper. Sí, una pregunta muy corta. Estabas hablando del experimento que se hizo en Canadá, ¿no? Y que se observó un aumento de los salarios y una reducción de las applications, no sé cómo se dice en castellano. Bueno, de los nuevos, de la gente que optaba a trabajos, ¿no? Y quería saber si había datos concretos sobre qué tipo de trabajos habían visto un mayor aumento en los salarios y mayor reducción en la gente que aplicaba a ellos, ¿no? Si era trabajos más precarios o algún tipo de trabajo en concreto, si había datos sobre eso. Ya está.
Sí, como ya se han hecho las preguntas en parte, si de esta experiencia que nos has transmitido, has hablado de los empresarios, de la gente que piensa, académicos, los artículos, las organizaciones sindicales, ¿podrías aportar algún dato si jugaron algún papel positivo, en negativo, los sindicatos? Si podrías aportarnos alguna cuestión sobre el papel que han jugado en ese experimento, bajo tu punto de vista.
¿Os parece que de momento cerramos aquí, que responda y si luego hay tiempo ya vemos qué pasa y si no, pues paramos y seguimos? ¿Sí? Your turn.
Okay, these are really good questions, and I don't, unfortunately, I don't have really good answers to all of them. But maybe I'll try to take them in order. First, Daniel's question on whether Gurvich fetishizes work. Yeah, clearly. They're doing that in this paper and in a number of other papers. They say explicitly that we shouldn't reduce necessary labor. He says that we shouldn't. And I can't find at any point in that paper or in one of his other papers, an argument as to why we should not try to automate or reduce necessary labor. He thinks that in some respect it is virtuous, and he makes some arguments about the virtue of working in a garden, and I think that there are virtues in working in your garden. I think that that's lovely and it can be completely valuable. The idea that it has to also be a commodity for it to truly be valuable is actually his argument. And I don't think that there is any kind of reasoning that he provides for it. On the question of unions, I think there are just different perspectives in play. Maybe I'll try to respond to sort of both of these points about unions. There are different perspectives. On the one hand, people sometimes say that a basic income will offer an inexhaustible strike fund, and so therefore unions ought to be in favor of it. On the other hand, the sort of counter mechanism is that insofar as people are individually powerful, they might be less dependent on unions. So, whether or not it impacts unions in a positive way, I think is a completely empirical question. You have mechanisms that are going in both directions. I personally find it a bit strange to come to an argument that would say, yes, we're okay with reducing individual people's bargaining power because we want to make them more dependent on unions, right? I think that is sometimes the sort of implicit argument, and I ultimately don't think that that's normatively desirable, at least from my perspective. The unions, as an aside, at the time, unions have changed their views over the years and across different contexts on basic income. I have a bunch of posters from the 70s in the Canadian context. A number of the big unions were completely on board and were sponsoring some of the big guaranteed income, basic income plans. And then that changed by the 2000s. They came to be opposed to it. I think a lot of it is going to depend on the details and sort of how it's framed. So that would be my general perspective. On the question about whether it was a success, whether the pilot was a success or not, or whether the experiment was in general a success, I think this is a huge question. You have tons of experiments, of basic income experiments and pilots, and nobody in advance says this would constitute success and that would constitute failure, right? There's no agreement, and instead, what do you get? You get some change, right? You get a change, you get an effect. And then after the fact, one party says, it was a success, look at the effect. And the other party says, look at the effect, it was a failure, right? So I think you have to kind of call your shots so to speak. It would be best if you, in advance, say what constitutes success. From my perspective, a smallish, non-trivial decline in labor force participation would be success. That's how I would define it. But I think you do have to sort of define in advance what constitutes success or failure. Otherwise, this kind of thing can be completely malleable in the media after the fact, right? On the sort of community versus RCT, Sergey's question, yeah, I mean, I'm a big advocate of the sort of saturation site community style experiment. Some people don't like it because it doesn't resemble sort of standard practice in health, you know, in testing drugs and so on, randomized control trials. But from my perspective, the randomized control trial just ignores so many real world facts, right? There are just all kinds of things in the world, like business, that exist, right? That just don't get incorporated, or people being influenced by other people. So insofar as we think that people are influenced by people, a community experiment is, in my view, going to matter, and a randomized control trial is just not going to capture it. There are, of course, also downsides to a community experiment. I think it's going to be hard to run a community experiment and it not be a circus, right? And it not attract a lot of media attention, which can be a problem in terms of interpretation, right? And there are also, I think, external validity sort of questions there too. In terms of increases in wages, which types of work changed? It's a good question, but I didn't analyze it. I could actually go back and try to gather that data. I do have the evidence, but I haven't asked the question. So it might be, it's the kind of thing that I could look at and might, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. David, thank you very much. This was luxury. Extremely interesting, and above all, I think this is only the beginning of the symposium and of the conversation we'll keep having over years, I hope. So thank you very much for being here. Em diuen pel WhatsApp que tendríamos que empezar a I-25, hauríem de començar a I-25, són I-17, crec que ens dirien a I-27, no passa res, però hi ha la Louise Hack connectada des de York, per tant, hauríem de fer una pausa de no més de 10 minuts i reprendre la marxa. Tampoc calia invitar un senyor o una persona del Canadà i tallar-lo ràpidament perquè estaven fora del temps. Però bueno, s'han de fer aquests equilibris. Fem així, no? A I-27, aquí comencem de nou. Thank you very much, David.